is, under your reading of 606B, is there anything that is an inquiry into the validity of a verdict other than a motion to set aside the verdict?
Well, I think that there might be certain types of claims of which prejudice is a component, and certainly if you brought a motion that was based on pure juror bias of the type that was at issue in cases such as Remmer versus United States and Smith versus Phillips.
Well, what would that motion would be presumably a motion to set aside the verdict?
I assume it would be framed that way rather than as a motion for a new trial.
The reason I ask is because they don't say that. It seems to me a broader definition of any inquiry into the validity of a verdict. If they wanted to say, if they only meant motion to set aside a verdict, you'd think they would have said that.
Yeah. I mean, I off the top of my head, I can't think of another type of motion for new trial that would be treated differently. But certainly, wherever the claim depends in any way on what took place in the jury room, the evidence would, of course, still be subject to the rule. And again, that sweeps in claims of juror bias. It sweeps in all of the types of claims about which the framers of Rule 606B were clearly concerned, claims involving the manner in which the jury reached the verdict, claims involving compromise verdicts, quotient verdicts, and the like. And I think, if anything, to the extent that the drafting history of Rule 606B is relevant, it tells us two things. First, there's no indication that the framers of the rule intended to disturb what was the prevailing practice at common law, particularly after this Court's decision in Clark. There's simply nothing in the history of the rule that suggests that. And if anything, I think that the history of the rule suggests that the central focus in framing the rule was on excluding evidence concerning the manner in which the jury reached its verdict, and not evidence that was used to demonstrate that the jury was improperly constituted. Now, again, because the rule focuses on the inquiry mandated by the claim at issue, we think that ours is the better textual interpretation. But at a minimum, if the Court thinks that the rule is somehow by its terms ambiguous, I would simply make 2 points. First, we do think that the canon of constitutional avoidance would apply in this context. At least one court of appeals has held that there would be a constitutional problem with excluding evidence in cases involving racial bias. We believe that there would be a serious constitutional concern more generally because the right to adequate voir dire is, as this Court has said, part of the right to trial by an impartial jury. But even if the Court doesn't think that this is a matter for constitutional avoidance, we certainly think that there is a constitutionally based interest here, the interest in protecting a litigant's right to a fair trial. And we believe that that interest does outweigh the countervailing interest in finality and jury secrecy.
Well,
now, in Clark,
a party has a right to a competent jury, doesn't it?
Yes, that is true.
A constitutional right to that, and yet you couldn't inquire. The Court has held that there can't be an inquiry into whether the jurors were intoxicated.
Well, that is true, but I think that the Court reached that conclusion based entirely on the outside influence exception, and I think part of the reason why that is true is that I think that the Court viewed the inquiry in that case in Tanner as requiring a showing of prejudice. In other words, I think that the Court was operating on the premise that the underlying claim there would require a showing that the drunkenness actually redounded to the moving party's prejudice. My point is simply that when we're looking at the policy balancing that is required here, the better point of reference is this Court's decision in Clark, where the Court suggested, albeit in the context of contempt proceedings, that concerns about fairness outweighed the litany of concerns about jury secrecy and harassment.
But
now, to be sure,
there was leaving out the conspicuous difference. There was no jury verdict impugned in the contempt case.
That is correct, although the Court did indicate that its rule was consistent with the common law no impeachment rule. But I think with regard to the policy considerations, it certainly is true that this case is different because it does possess a final verdict. But I think with regard to finality, I would point to the experience in the jurisdictions that have adopted our rule, which confirms that if evidence of this variety is admissible, verdicts are only rarely set aside, and that is because McDonough itself sets an appropriately high standard. And, of course, the only question before the Court in this case concerns the admissibility of this evidence. It would be open to the district court on remand to decide what to do with this evidence if it is admitted, Our submission is simply that Rule 606B, by its terms, permits the admission of this evidence because it is not being admitted in an inquiry into the validity of the verdict. And if I can reserve the balance of my time for rebuttal.
Thank you, counsel.